Today we're going to start Unit 5 of Biology 102. We're going to go into animal diversification. So animals are going to be a branch of the eukarya domain. In the previous unit, we covered plants and fungi. Now we're going to go to the animals. Remember, the fungi are going to be closer related to animals than they were to plants. So what exactly is an animal? Well, in order for there to be an animal, we have three distinct characteristics. Animals are going to eat other organisms, so in order to acquire energy by consuming things, they have to consume other organisms to do that. Animals move, so all animals are going to have the ability to move at some stage of their life cycle, maybe not in all stages, but in some. And animals are going to be multicellular. That means they're going to consist of multiple cells and body parts. Some will have specific specialized activities for those specific cells. When we're talking about animals, humans like to put things in higher or lower. With animals, there really isn't a higher or lower species. That's where we have what's known as our human bias that comes in. Lower we often refer to as being kind of more primitive, usually referred to depending on how closely a species resembles humans, and that's how we look at it. There's going to be two possible states for a species. It could be extant, which means that that species is currently existing, or it could be extinct, which means that it no longer exists. Evolution can lead to a greater adaptation between organisms and its environment, so things are constantly changing over time. But it doesn't necessarily lead to something being greater complexity or being of a higher, more advanced type of animal. So the fact that a species exists means that it can do the things that all organisms must do. And like we said, that was to find food. It needs to be able to move to escape predators, and it has to actually be able to reproduce as well. We're going to have four distinct distinctions divide the animals. And we're going to start out by what we know now as looking at the DNA or RNA sequences, so we can analyze this data and we can tell what group that animal belongs in and how to categorize it. With each of these distinctions, so it's going to hinge on a particular adaptation, and the question is going to be whether an animal descends from an ancestor with the adaptation. So looking here, this is something we'll constantly go back to, or we'll be talking about through the next section, is first, we're going to have to go into, does that animal have specialized cells that form defined tissues? If no, then it will fall into the sponges. We're going to talk about these in detail. Does the animal develop with radial symmetry or with bilateral symmetry? If it's radial, it'll be what's known as a cnidarian. If it's bilateral, then you see all the other groups that fall into that category. Does growth occur by adding to the body continuously or by molting? And if it goes into that, if it adds to the body continuously, then it'll be under the flatworms, the annelids, and mollusks. Or if it grows by molting, it would be under the roundworms and arthropods. Then we're going to talk about, does it develop, going into if it develops from front to back, that's going to be the protozomes. And if it develops from back to front, that means that the anus forms first before the mouth, then that's going to be the deuterostomes. So, starting with the first one. Does an animal have specialized cells to form defined tissues? Well, specialized cells are going to include things, let's say, such as skin cells, muscle cells, sensory cells. So, and if an animal has no specialized tissue, it's just made up of one type of cell, then that's going to be the group that has a common structure. Then we don't go any further. That's going to belong to the phylum Porphyria, best known as our sponges. So sponges are going to be aggregations of similar cells with little coordination of activities among those cells. If it does have specialized tissues, this is going to be all other animals that form a monophyletic group of animals with clearly defined tissues. Humans, for example, have highly specialized cells such as skin cells, muscle cells, and sensory cells. Does the animal develop with radial symmetry or does it develop with bilateral symmetry? Basically, a body structured like a pie for radial or a body with a left and right side which mirror each other. That's going to be your bilateral symmetry. So with the radial, describes animals structured like a pie, like we said, and these are going to be things such as our jellyfishes, corals, and sea anemones. These are usually going to be slow-moving or they could be free-floating. They don't usually have a front or a back end, and it's possible to make multiple slices out of them, all going through the center and divide the organism into identical pieces. If it's bilateral symmetry, they have left and right sides that are going to mirror images of each other. They can move adeptly, they can search for food, and they can avoid predators. Examples of these would be things like humans, cows, and scorpions. Down at the bottom, you see a picture of radial symmetry and bilateral. The third thing, during gut development, does the mouth or the anus develop first? So this is going to be our protostomes and our deuterostomes. So about 630 million years ago, in early evolution of animals, we're going to have a major split that occurs. This is going to allow us to separate the bilaterally symmetrical animals with divine tissues into two distinct lineages. If it's a protostome, which means mouth first, or it could be a deuterostome, which means mouth second. That's basically where the gut starts to develop first, and it develops from back to front. So the anal opening develops first, and it comes through the center of the body until the mouth develops last. Now going back to these really quick, with the protostomes, some examples of these, you'll have your mollusks, annelids, and arthropods. And then with our deuterostomes, you'll have things like humans, you'll have echinoderms, and you'll have chordates, which the humans fall under. The fourth thing is going to be, does it grow by molting or by adding to the animal's body in a continuous manner? Now, protostomes, molting. Well, among the bilaterally symmetrical animals that are protostomes, there's going to be an important distinction between animals that can molt, which is shed an exoskeleton. Remember, that's going to be made of the chitin substance, which is a carbohydrate, and it replaces it with a larger one at a regular interval during their life. And animals that grow by adding to size of their skeletal elements in a more continuous manner than among molting animals. So here we look at our invertebrates. These are going to be simply animals that don't have a backbone. It's going to account for more than 95% of animal species. Here we'll see three different body types. You can have what's known as a soft body, like worms. You could have a soft body inside a shell, like a snail. You could have those with exoskeletons, which are going to have rigid external coverings. And these are going to be things like insects and crustaceans, or you could have your arthropods. And these are going to be the largest number of species with about 75%, and that's going to include insects, spiders, scorpions, lobsters, crabs, and even shrimp. So going into these, like we said with the invertebrates, it's whether or not it has a backbone. So invertebrates, we said, do not have a backbone. The invertebrates are going to include 8 separate evolutionary lineages with an enormous diversity of body forms, body sizes, habitats, and behaviors. The vertebrates, however, are going to have the backbone. With invertebrates, animals without a backbone are going to be the most diverse group, with 25% of all of those described are going to be beetles. So that is going to be the largest type of insect or largest type of invertebrate that we have for a single type. Now going into our sponges, remember they belong to the phylum Porifera. Their common characteristics are going to be that, remember, they have no tissue or organs. They're going to be made up of the same type of cell pretty much. They have three little distinctions, but it's not enough to really distinguish them from the other types of animals, like we're getting into the cnidarians later. This will be that they have epidermal cells, which are just going to be that outer covering. These epidermal cells are going to be kind of flat, skin-like cells that cover the outside of the sponge. They'll have something called a collar cell that covers the inside of the sponge and maintains a flagellum. With that, it's going to create a current that helps carry water upward and out through the top of the sponge. So if you look at the holes at the top, this is where they're going to carry the water out. So they bring it in through the side and carry it out through the top. And then they have what's referred to as amoebocyte cells. These are going to be mobile cells that can help digest, store, and transport nutrients. Now with these, all of these different types of cells, none of them make up a particular type of organ. So it's all going to be in this one simple structure. They're going to lack symmetry. The body is going to be a hollow tube basically with pores in its walls. And it's going to feed by filter feeding. So basically it's going to feed by pumping water, bacteria, algae, small organic materials through the pores. It's going to actually reproduce sexually. And so as it reproduces sexually, it is going to be a hermaphrodite. That means it makes both male and female gametes. It can only produce one kind of gamete at a time though, so it does not self-fertilize. It can reproduce asexually, and that's not going to be considered part of the hermaphroditic development. And it's going to do this by producing small buds that are going to form on the outside of the sponge. They then break off and they settle on the bottom and grow a new sponge. So they will have a life cycle or a part possibly of where they break off and float around. Otherwise, they are going to be sessile, and that's usually their form as adults. Now, when they break off and have that free-swimming larva, they can move and go far away, or they can break off and kind of stay around the same area. With these, there's going to be about 5,000 different types of species. So let's look at it a little bit closer. We discussed some of these. We said it was sessile. It had no particular tissues. All the cells are basically going to be about the same, and we have just three distinct types that we did kind of talk about. The epidermal cells, which are going to be those outer flattened cells that cover the outside. We have those collar cells, which have the flagellum that cover the inside. Remember, that's going to help push the water up so it comes out of the top hole. And then the middle layer is going to be kind of like a gel layer with embedded fibers that stiffen the sponge's body. So you see the gel. So we talked about each one of these containing both male and female reproductive organs, but they only produce one type of gamete at a time, so they do not self-fertilize. So sponges that are acting as males, what they're going to do is they're going to release a cloud of sperm that swim to other sponges, which are acting as females, and they fertilize those eggs. The eggs will then develop into larvae, which are going to be released into the water, and they will drift for a few days before settling on a rock or coral outcrop and developing into a sessile adult. Now with sponges, they can also reproduce, like we said, asexually. And what's going to happen is they're going to have a bud break off, and it's going to float to another section. It's going to settle on the bottom the same way that the others did, and it's going to grow into a new sponge. So it can break off, it can be a polyp, and as it's floating around, it can be called a medusa. So is your kitchen sponge an animal? Is it alive? Not all sponges are going to actually come from the sponge animal. Only specific ones that you buy at stores, usually they're labeled if it's going to be a real sponge, but they are not in the nice square shape. These are going to be the ones that kind of have a shape that's not going to be, it's more of an irregular shape, and they're going to be kind of a tan color. So because the dried skeletons of some sponges are soft and absorbent, we have used them for a long time. But these are going to be far from living. Once you get them, that is basically just going to be kind of the skeleton of that organism. Because of overfishing, it's dramatically reduced the populations of sponges, and so they're not very widely available like they used to be. Most of the sponges, like we said, are going to be made from synthetic materials, and these are going to be things that you might know as loofah sponges, and they're actually not going to be a sponge that kind of mimic that sponge. So in summary, sponges are going to be among the simplest of the animal lineages. A sponge consists of a hollow tube with pores in its wall, and it has no tissue or organs. They reproduce sexually by producing eggs and sperm, and asexually by budding. The fertilized egg is going to grow into a free-floating, swimming larva that settles and develops into a sessile, filter-feeding adult sponge. Next, we'll go into the jellyfish and other cnidarians that are amongst the most poisonous animals in the world. So with the jellyfish and other things like the sun coral and the anemone, these can actually have very potent neurotoxins in them. So the cnidarians are going to be in the phylum Cnidaria. Their common characteristics are going to be that they're radially symmetrical, and they're going to have tentacles that are going to be armed with rows of stinging cells. These cells are going to be used to paralyze their prey. They're going to consist of a specific type of cell called a cnidocyte. It's going to have a coiled thread with barbs inside that are going to trigger the outside. When something comes into contact with the trigger, the coiled thread is then going to be ejected and is going to penetrate the prey and eject the toxin. So with cnidarians, you're going to have two types of bodies. You have the sessile polyp, and you have the free-floating medusa. We saw this before. In some species, individuals are going to spend part of their life cycle as a polyp and then part as a medusa. In other species, it includes those which only a medusa occurs, or, as in corals and sea anemones, individuals only occur in polyps. They can reproduce, again, both sexually and asexually, just like the sponges. And they're going to be carnivores that use things called cnidocytes. And these are going to be their stinging cells. Now, with the cnidarians, when they're in their polyp form, they're going to be a vase shape, and they're going to have a mouth that is going to be directed upwards. Now, when they're in the medusa shape, they're going to kind of be bell-shaped, and the mouth is going to be directed downwards. So looking here, we talked about this cnidocyte in action. So you've got the coiled thread, you've got a trigger, so if something brushes up against it, it's going to activate that trigger. The coiled thread is going to come out, it's going to puncture into an animal, such as that fish in the picture, and it's going to inject its toxins. We have three major groups of cnidarians. We have the corals, sea anemones, and the jellyfish. So starting out with the corals, they're going to be small, soft-bodied polyps that are going to be living in large colonal groups. They secrete a calcium carbonate, which is going to build the outside part of their body, so that's going to give it that hard outer structure. Inside of that, it actually has a soft body. It's going to have stinging tentacles that surround the mouth, and it's going to help it catch some small fish and plankton. Reproduction can be done both sexually and asexually. So if it's reproducing sexually, it's going to release sperm and eggs into the water. Internally, sperm gets released and it fertilizes the egg inside the female coral. So it can reproduce both ways sexually. So how is global warming affecting the coral reefs of the world? Well, as the temperatures heat up, it's going to cause what's known as a coral bleaching. This coral bleaching affects the photosynthesis of these corals, and so without the colored algae that it has on the outside, the corals appear to be white. And this actually can endanger them and cause them to start to die out. And so we're seeing less and less diversity amongst our corals than we used to have 20, 30, even 50 years ago. Next, we're going into the sea anemones. The sea anemones have always been kind of a pretty animal. Lots of people like to look at them because they resemble flowers. They're going to have a free-swimming larval stage. It's going to look like an upside-down medusa from a jellyfish, and so that medusa is going to be basically what I call a jellyfish look. It also has the tentacles with stinging cells on top surrounding its mouth, and it's going to settle on a rock and change over into an adult. Now, as an adult, it's going to become much slower, and it may even appear to have a crawling nature to it. The jellyfishes are not actually going to be fish. That's going to be a misnomer, but they do look like they're made of jelly. They're going to range tremendously in size. For example, the Asian jellyfish can be 6 feet and nearly 500 pounds. The Irukandji jellyfish is going to be the size of a hen's egg. Some species are even deadly. The Irukandji, like we just said, were going to be deadly. Those are the ones the size of a hen's egg. A sighting of them even halted the filming of the movie Fool's Gold. Next, we're going into flatworms, roundworms, and segmented worms. They're going to come in all shapes and sizes. So looking here at this lovely guy on your left, he is a tapeworm. You might have heard of him before. Tapeworms are going to be known for attacking or attaching themselves basically to the intestines of animals and sucking the nutrients out. On the other side, you're going to see what's known as a liver fluke. Now with these flatworms, they're going to be in the phylum Platyhelminths. They're defined or have defined tissues. These are going to be protostomes. They have a well-defined head and tail region. They have a definite body plan as they're developing. It's going to be a bilateral symmetry. They're hermaphroditic and can engage in both sexual and asexual reproduction. And they have some single openings in the body, which is going to serve as the mouth, and then one that's going to serve as the anus. Now with these, they have no body cavity inside. Basically, they have a space between the body wall and the digestive tracts. That's not a fluid-filled cavity. It's going to grow by adding to its body mass. And so looking here, we said it had no body cavity. It's going to has a reduced capacity for diffusion of gases and nutrients. It does not molt. It has clusters of light-sensitive cells, which are going to be called eye spots. They include more than 20,000 species in the flatworms and can be parasitic. Things such as the flukes and the tapeworms are going to be commonly known parasites. Lots of them can be brilliantly colored like we see in these flatworms here, the flukes, and they're going to be free-living aquatic creatures. Next, we have what's known as the roundworms. These are going to be in the phylum Nematoda. Now with these, it's also known as the nematodes. They do have defined tissues. These are also going to be protostomes. They develop with a body plan. They have bilateral symmetry as well. They're going to be seen as being very long, narrow, unsegmented bodies. That's going to be important because once we get into earthworms, those are segmented. Roundworms are not. They're going to be surrounded by strong, flexible cuticle, and they have to molt in order to grow larger. So not adding to body size, these are molting. And there's going to be more than 90,000 species. With these, they are probably going to be the most abundant animals on Earth. A lot of these live as parasites in plant roots. They can actually damage or kill the plants. About 15,000 species are going to be parasites of other animals, actually. And so with those, they're going to be responsible for a lot of human disease and a lot of animal disease. Lots of these are going to be transmitted through either soil or fecal matter. So for example, things like elephantitis, which causes the body to retain lymphatic fluid and to swell and have edema in certain areas. And this is going to be the roundworm that's responsible. Another roundworm is going to be trichinosis or trichinella worm. This is going to have cysts that you're going to find, it's going to put in the muscles. And when you consume these mussels, which are going to be the meat that you eat, if it's undercooked, it can start to grow in the intestines and it forms cysts. These cysts are then going to move into the muscle of the new host. So it can cause some cramping, it can cause terrible pain in the muscles, and make you very sick from this. Next, we're going to head into the segmented worms. These are referred to as the annelids. So they're going to be in the phylum Annelida. They have definite defined tissues. They're also going to be protostomes, and they develop with a body plan. That body plan is going to be bilateral symmetry. With this type of worm, though, it is going to be segmented. These are going to grow by adding mass to the body, so not by molting, and you're going to have 3 different groups of these. The first group you see here is going to be the polychaetes. These are going to be marine worms that live on the sea floor. It basically means many bristles. As you see, it has a lot of bristles on them, and I actually think these are pretty cool little worms if you ever watch any animal documentaries. They look like bright little Christmas trees with some of them that you see at the bottom corner. Some are going to be burrowing, and so when they burrow through the mud, they're going to extract nutrients from that mud as they're digging. Some are going to be tube dwelling. They're going to use sand grains or limestone to make a tube where they can live, and only tentacles of these are actually going to be exposed, and they're going to use those tentacles to help trap food. All in all, there's going to be about 9,000 species of these. And so here's some examples of polychaetes. Next, we have the annelid, which is going to be the earthworm. These are actually going to be part of what's known as oligochaetes. They range in size from about ½ an inch to 10 feet long. They are known as bulk feeders, so they consume particles of soil and organic matter. Inorganic matter is going to also come through their body and be processed and excreted with the feces in something known as castings. Now, castings are going to be very important to gardeners. An earthworm can produce its own weight in castings every day. It's going to be very nutritious for the plants that gardener is going to grow. It's going to be a breakdown of organic nutrients, and since it's broken down, it makes it readily available for that plant to soak it in through its roots. Leeches are going to be another type of annelid. They also have segmented bodies, and there's going to be 2 different types. You have what's called the blood-sucking leeches and the non-blood-sucking leeches. As far as the blood-sucking, their saliva is going to contain an anticoagulant substance, and what that does is it prevents blood from clotting. These are going to make up more than half of the species of leeches. The non-blood-sucking leeches are going to make up the remaining species of leeches. Some feed on smaller annelid worms, some snails, and aquatic insect larvae. About 500 species of about 13,000 total. Mollusks. So most mollusks are going to live in shells. These belong to the phylum Mollusca. They have a defined tissue. They are bilaterally symmetrical. They're protostomes, and they grow by adding to their tissue. They're going to consist of 5 main components. They have a visceral mass, they have a shell, they have a mantle, they have a foot, and they have a radula. So, and with that, let's go ahead and talk about these different ones. So as far as the visceral mass, they're going to contain internal organs, digestive tract. They have paired kidneys and reproductive organs. As far as the shell, it's going to be made up of a calcium carbonate, and it's going to protect that visceral mass that's going to be inside. It prevents desiccation, which means drying out, and it's not going to be present in all mollusks that you see, but a lot. Mantle is going to be a covering that partly surrounds the visceral mass. It's going to secrete a calcium carbonate used to form a shell and may help develop gills or lungs for that animal. Some of them will have a foot, and that's simply going to be a muscular tissue that's adapted for locomotion, attachment, food capture, or a combination of all of those. And then we come to the radula. That's going to be a tongue-like structure that's bearing many rows of teeth and is going to be used for feeding. Not present in all mollusks, so you won't see it in all of them. So with these, most are going to be marine, but you will find some in fresh water and some are going to be in terrestrial areas. One group is going to be called the gastropod. It's going to be found both in aquatic and terrestrial environments, and it's going to include things like snails, land slugs, whelks, conchs, and sea slugs. The snails and the slugs are going to account for 3/4 of all mollusks. And so what that basically is with a gastropod, its name basically means bellyfoot. And it's named so because they have an expanded foot on the bottom of their belly. They also have a one-piece shell. So they, like we said, they account for 3/4 of those mollusks. These slugs are going to be snails that have reduced their shell to a tiny remnant that isn't even visible. And it's going to be covered by a mantle, so you won't see it. They, like we said, are going to be found both in aquatic and terrestrial areas. They do have protective defenses. Like we said, they have a shell. If you've ever seen a slug or a snail, you know it has slime. It can have a chemical defense. With that chemical defense, sometimes it makes its own chemical toxins. Sometimes it will recycle another animal's chemical toxins. And then sometimes it can use another animal's defenses. For example, a sea slug can use the stinging cells from anemones after they ingest them. There's going to be about 35,000 species of gastropods. Next, we have the bivalve mollusks. These are going to be found in both aquatic environments, so we have them in marine and freshwater. Clams, scallops, oysters, and mussels are going to have a pair of shells that can clamp together, and that's there to protect their soft body. There's going to be roughly about 8,000 species of bivalves. Most of them are going to live in the ocean. Some are going to live in freshwater. They are going to be filter feeders. With this, they're going to draw a current of water through a tube-like section called an incurrent siphon, and that's going to come across their gills. Water's then going to go out through the excurrent siphon. So with these, your clams, they're going to spend their lives buried in the mud or sand on the floor. Scallops are going to live on the sea floor. And then oysters are going to fasten themselves to underwater objects, things like rocks, pilings that support piers, boat hulls. Basically, they're all going to be protected by a pair of shells that are going to be hinged together, like we said, by a ligament, and they're all going to be filter feeders. Next, we come to the cephalopods. Cephal means head, pod means foot. So basically, they are going to have their foot and their head together there. They're going to be found in marine environments, and they include things like the nautiluses, squids, octopuses, and cuttlefishes. Now with the nautiluses here, we have 6 different species. They have an external shell, which is going to be used for protection. They're free swimming. The squid are going to have about 300 species. These are also free swimming. They contained a reduced internal shell and possess actual ink sacs. And they're going to use these to squirt a cloud of ink into the direction of the predator in order to escape. They also have 8 short tentacles and 2 long sucker-bearing tentacles. Then you see the octopus here. There's going to be about 400 species. These are going to lack shells. They have 8 short tentacles called arms, They are referred to as bottom dwellers because you'll see them usually living amongst coral reefs and rocky coast, crawling across the bottom. These also can possess ink sacs, and they use them to squirt a cloud of ink in the direction of the predator in order to escape. So all species of these are going to have tentacles, and they're going to use them, like we said, for walking, swimming, and capturing prey. Altogether with the cephalopods, there's going to be more than 100,000 species. Are some animals smarter than others? Well, are octopuses smart? Octopuses are known to be multitaskers. They can do several things at a time. They can use all of their tentacles to do something different. They have learned how to unscrew a jar to obtain food by watching scientists and people who work with them show them how to do it. But does this technically make them intelligent? Humans describe intelligence as being able to problem solve. Is this just an evolutionary pressure that's been put on octopuses to figure out how to unscrew and open things up for food? Or is it a measure of their intelligence? So in summary, the predatory behavior of octopuses involves exploration and manipulation. These behaviors are considered as intelligent by humans, but the concept of intelligence can't be applied objectively to other species. Rather, species should be viewed as having evolved in response to selective forces at work in their own particular niches. Arthropods are going to be one of the most diverse groups of animals. The four major lineages of arthropods are going to be the arachnids, which are going to include spiders, mites, ticks, and scorpions. The crustaceans, which include lobsters, crabs, shrimp, and barnacles. The millipedes and centipedes. And, of course, the insects. Now with the arthropods, their common characteristics is that they do have segmented bodies, and there's going to be about 1 million different types of species of arthropods. 75% of all animal species actually falls under the arthropod group. 60% of all species on Earth, of all animals. So their main characteristics are going to be that they are protostomes, invertebrates, they have segmented bodies, they have a distinct head, thorax, and abdomen. They're going to have an exoskeleton that's going to be made up of a stiff carbohydrate, like we said, called chitin. It's going to help provide them with protection from injury and predators. It also helps conserve water and prevents desiccation, but it prohibits growth, so they're going to have to molt for the most part. They have jointed appendages. And so with these, we see that we have insects with 800,000 species, arachnids with 60,000, crustaceans with 52,000, and then the millipedes and centipedes with about 10,000. So with the arthropods making up 75% of the animal species, the arthropod phylum is going to be so large that even if we excluded all of the insects, they would still be the most diverse arthropod group. It would still contain more species than any other phylum. So with these, we can see the insects here. We can see the millipedes and centipedes. We can see the arachnids and, of course, the crustaceans. So let's go ahead and start with the arachnids. We'll go back here. The arachnids are going to include your spiders, mites, ticks, and scorpions. Usually they're going to have 4 pairs of walking legs or appendages. They're going to be located on the thorax. They have specialized mouth parts, and they're known as predators. Now with these specialized mouth parts, the spider is going to have specific ones called fangs. If it's a scorpion, it's going to be kind of a grinding mouth part. They're going to be distinguished from other arthropods because they're going to have legs only on that thorax there. With spiders, you're going to have spider venom, which is going to contain two types of enzymes. The first type is going to disrupt the prey's nervous system and is going to cause it to paralyze it. Then the other enzyme is going to start to dissolve the internal organs. These internal organs are going to liquefy, and then the spider is going to use its fangs to suck the nutrients out. Two spiders that are going to be dangerous to humans, they're going to be the black widow. It's going to be identified easily by red hourglass marking on the bottom surface of the female, and it's going to produce a protein venom that affects the victim's nervous system. So some slightly affected by venom, and others might be severely affected by this venom. Symptoms from the venom could include things like local pain, muscle cramps, nausea, vomiting, and chest pain. Another one you've probably heard a lot about is going to be the brown recluse. It's going to lack distinctive markings, but it's actually more dangerous. Its bites are usually painless too. Symptoms are going to include things like severe pain after the bite, nausea, vomiting, blisters. It's going to have necrosis or tissue death of the skin or the adipose or fat tissue there. Then that necrosis or tissue death could lead to an open wound that lasts for months or even years. Sometimes it even requires a skin graft to close it. With the arachnids, you're going to have about 60,000 species. Next, we had the millipedes and centipedes. With the millipedes and centipedes, they are going to have long segmented bodies that seem almost worm-like. Millipede is going to have what we call 1,000 feet. Centipede is going to have what we call 100 feet. The meanings are not actually going to be true though, although millipedes are going to have more feet than the centipedes. They do have jointed appendages, like we said with these feet. They're going to have a hard exoskeleton made of chitin, and usually they're going to be found living in things like forests, where they're found primarily among the leaf litter, which is going to be cool and moist. Millipedes will feed on decaying plant material, while centipedes are going to be predators. They're going to use venomous fangs to kill insects and even small mammals. They use jaws to tear their prey open or tear them into pieces that are small enough for them to eat. And there's going to be about 10,000 species here. With the chelicerates, we're going to have about 60,000 species. These are going to include things like horseshoe crab species and arachnids, land-dwelling arthropods that include spiders, scorpions, mites, and ticks. Next, we have the crustaceans. They're going to include things like lobsters, crabs, shrimp, and barnacles. Most are going to be aquatic dwelling, but can include some terrestrial species. They have a lot or many modified legs. For example, your shrimp and barnacles are going to have a cone-like projection that's going to be used to capture plankton. Lobster, crabs, and shrimp are going to have legs on the abdomen region, and they're going to use these to hold eggs and newly hatched young. Most common feature is that they have 5 pairs of appendages extending from the head. 3 are going to be used for feeding, while 2 are going to be used as antenna and help to sense their environment. There's going to be about 52,000 species. And so they have that one common feature, which is those 5 pairs of appendages. With insects, they're going to have 3 pairs of walking legs. That's going to be the most distinctive thing that we know about insects. They're going to be the most diverse group of arthropods. With these 3 pair of walking legs, most are going to have 1 or 2 pairs of wings that extend from the thorax. Their life consists of separate life stages. Most are going to live on land, and some can live in the aquatic region. There's going to be about 800,000 species. With the ones that have wings, they have the ability to fly, and they became actually part of a developmental process of metamorphosis and have led to their great diversification. So in summary, the arthropods are going to be protostome invertebrates and with nearly 1 million species. Probably at least as many, if not more, have to be identified. We have not found them yet. They actually outnumber all other forms of life in species diversity. Centipedes are going to be the predators with fangs that inject venom. Millipedes are going to be herbivores that feed on dead plant material. Spiders and scorpions are going to be predatory arthropods that eat insects and occasionally small vertebrates. Lobsters, crabs, shrimp, and barnacles are going to be predatory marine crustaceans. Insects with adaptations that include the ability to fly and metamorphosis are going to be the most diverse group of arthropods. So how many species are there on Earth? Well, it might come as a surprise to learn that we don't really know. Some scientists are going to put the number at around 3 million, while others believe it could be even greater, up to 100 million. In a famous paper published in 1982, the biologist Terry Irwin laid out a simple approach to estimating the answer. His strategy was two-pronged. It began by posing the question that he could answer with a high degree of accuracy. Irwin set out to get a definitive count of all the beetle species living in a canopy of a single species of tree in a tropical forest in Panama. Over the course of 3 seasons, he sprayed a fog of pesticides into the canopy of 19 trees of this species, and then he collected and identified the beetles that fell to the ground. Here's what he found. 1,143 different species of beetles fell from those trees. Other researchers found even more, so it's estimated to be around 12,000 species. So how is the number of beetle species in one tree species related to the number of all insects in all types of trees? Well, I would hope someone will challenge these figures with more data, but unfortunately this isn't an answer to our original question. What type of species are the most difficult to estimate or count? So determining how many distinct species are on Earth has long been a challenge for biologists. By counting the exact number of beetle species in one species of tropical tree, then estimating several parameters that can be used to extrapolate this number, the number of species of all arthropods across the entire tropics, it is possible to make headway on this challenge. So the initial estimate is using this method suggested that there may be many more species on Earth than previously believed. Flight and metamorphosis are going to produce the greatest adaptive radiation ever. With mammals, they get bigger and bigger with the more they eat, so why don't insects? Well, looking at metamorphosis, you can have 2 different types. You have what's called complete metamorphosis and incomplete metamorphosis. Complete metamorphosis is where an animal completely changes over into a different animal throughout its stages. So it has a larva stage where the egg hatches into a larva, and then it's going to eat and grow and it molts. It forms a pupa where that larva encloses itself into a case as its body structures break down and forms new structures. And then it forms its adult stage that emerges from the pupa and no longer grows. Incomplete metamorphosis is going to be where it has a pattern of growth and development which the organism does not pass through separate, dramatically different stages. So it starts out as a nymph, where the egg hatches into the nymph, it resembles a small version of that adult, but it does not have wings or reproductive organs. So it's going to grow and then molt several times. Once it reaches its adult stage, it's then going to stay that size. It's going to stop molting, and that's the adult form. Notice it also has wings. So the arthropods are protostome invertebrates with nearly 1 million species and probably at least many more yet to identify. The ability to fly and the development process of metamorphosis as a means of overcoming constraints of having a rugged exoskeleton have contributed to the enormous ecological diversity of insects. The life cycle of most insects includes a larval stage that is devoted to feeding and growth, and a pupal stage during which metamorphosis occurs. As an adult, The insect can then reproduce. Echinoderms are going to be vertebrates that are going to be closest to its invertebrate relatives. These are going to include things like sea stars, sea urchins, and sand dollars. So with these, they're going to contain about 6,000 species. All are going to be marine-dwelling species. They are radially symmetrical. They're going to have larvae that are going to be bilaterally symmetrical. They're enclosed by a hard skeleton beneath a spiny plate. These are actually going to be deuterostomes. They do not have a brain, but they do contain central ring of nerves, and it's going to branch into each appendage. They have what's known as tube feet. These are going to be extensions of internal systems, water-filled tubes. They're going to radiate throughout the body, and they're going to be used for locomotion and for feeding. They are closely related to the chordates. So echinoderm larvae are going to be bilaterally symmetrical, remember, and the echinoderm larvae are anatomically characteristics that are going to be common with larvae of primitive features. So like we said, the nervous system consists of that central ring of nerves. They're going to extend it to the appendages, and it will have tube feet. So because they're deuterostomes, as are vertebrates, the echinoderms are the invertebrates that are going to be the most closely evolutionarily related to the vertebrates. Their aquatic larvae are going to be bilaterally symmetrical, and they're going to share some anatomical features with chordates. But the adult echinoderms are going to be radially symmetrical. Going into the phylum Chordata. These are going to be animals with backbones. So we're going to stop here with our invertebrates, and we'll pick up with the vertebrates on our next section.